Hello, everybody. I know there are more people coming, but I think we do have to start now. We're looking forward to a presentation today on Presidents in Unexpected Places by Ralph Buglass, and Diane is going to introduce him. Please go ahead, Diane.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I think you're going to be very pleased to hear Ralph's presentation tonight. We are fortunate to have Ralph Buglass, and he's a frequent speaker for the Montgomery County History at the Historical Society in our neighboring Montgomery County. He also teaches lifelong learning courses at the American University, Johns Hopkins University, Montgomery College, and Frederick Community College. This presentation is a part of a course that he gives at the American University Osler Lifelong Learning Institute called Off the Beaten Path in the DC area. Ralph, we welcome you.
All right. Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure being here. Let me just go ahead and a few
Ralph,
things.
let me just mention that you're going to expect questions only at the end of your presentation, okay?
Oh, yes. And if you have a question as we go through, feel free to put it into the chat. We'll check the chat also at the end for questions.
That's right at the bottom of your...
Right.
So again, thanks for everyone to taking the time tonight to learn about presidents in, as I say, unexpected places, not what you might think of as the usual memorials in Washington. And here are probably the big three: the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Jefferson Memorial. Certainly the ones that the tourists flock to. But in each of these cases, you probably weren't aware that these were not the first memorials to each of the presidents involved. In the case of George Washington, the first monument to George Washington, very near you in Frederick County, it's atop South Mountain, right on the border between Frederick and Washington County. It's, as you see, the first completed monument to the first president. It was done by citizens of nearby Boonesboro. They started July 4th, 1827, and then finished up a few days later, had a ceremony. A newspaper account at the time said that as this monument was raised in much haste, we cannot boast the regular accuracy of perfect beauty, yet it possesses both solidity and durability, two important qualities. Though rude and naked of all charms of architecture, it has such strength as it will preserve it for the ages. And indeed, it has continued to this day. However, it did need to be rebuilt twice. So 1827. Now, there's also a monument to George Washington in the middle of Baltimore. It's in Mount Vernon Square, a very pretty part of Baltimore. Now, the cornerstone, it was started before the Boonesboro Monument, which is in a state park today, Maryland State Park. But this was not completed until 1829. And so the monument in what is called Washington Monument State Park is indeed the first one in the country to the first president. The Washington Monument was started 1848, and you probably know that it's sort of two-tone. About the bottom third of it is a little lighter. It's hard to see here than the upper portion of the monument. It was started before the Civil War as a private effort. Money ran out, and then the Civil War intervened, and construction stopped. And then when it was resumed after the Civil War, the stone from the original quarry was not available. And so they tried to match it as best they could. If in fact you have visiting relatives and you take them on a tour of the nation's capital, you can impress them with your insider's knowledge and say, well, it's two-tone because that actually marks the high water point of the Potomac River. that's really not so, but maybe it will get a laugh out of them. Now, later, or earlier, I should say, there was a statue to George Washington. It was commissioned by Congress, 1840, and it was outside of Congress, outside of the Capitol on the east side for quite a time. It was actually commissioned 1832, commissioned on the occasion of the centennial of Washington's birth. It was sculpted in Italy, and then quite a heavy statue. And so the first logistical problem was just getting it over to this country. Then as it was installed in the Capitol Rotunda, but so heavy that the floor of the rotunda began to sag. This marvelous book about some of the lesser known facts of the Washington area, out of print, but I have a copy here, says that just before the Civil War, Washington was moved again because it was causing the rotunda floor to sag. And so it was moved to what, as you see here, an open area. This is on the East Plaza of the Capitol. The book says, public ridicule then began in earnest because here was the heroic likeness of the father of the country, bare from the waist up, exposed to the elements. The bitter cold winds and rains swept the open plaza in winter. Snows clung to Washington's torso, also in the winter. Noting Washington's outstretched sword, one wag said he was sure that Washington was crying, "Take my sword if you will, but bring me some clothes." Well, the statue is no longer there. In the middle of the 20th century, it was moved to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and it's still there today. But if you look closely, it's not on that large base that you see when it was in front of the Capitol. Turns out that the base was too heavy also for the Smithsonian. It is somewhere in the heating plant of the U.S. Capitol, which is just to the side of the, just to the south of the Capitol building. You can see it along one of the highways in Washington. You can see the power plant. Where exactly it is inside that complex, I don't know, and it's not very well known. So Thomas Jefferson, again, the memorial that came about in the, it was about 1930 on the tidal basin, but about a century earlier, a statue of Thomas Jefferson was given as a gift to the United States. This statue was commissioned by a gentleman named Uriah Levy, first Jewish Commodore of the U.S. Navy. It served in the War of 1812. He very much admired Thomas Jefferson. In 1836, he purchased Monticello after Jefferson's death and restored it after its neglect. Well, again, from the book that I quoted earlier, it notes that even though this was given as a gift to the United States, Congress had to formally accept the gift. And the book notes that in the first half of the 19th century, American tolerance for persons of a different race or religion was not high, and a gift from a man named Levy made some members of Congress uncomfortable. Within a year, the statue was removed from the Capitol, placed on the north grounds of the White House. Here's a photo of that when it was in front of the White House. Of course, it's not there now, but the book notes that the executive branch apparently was less squeamish at the time. However, 40 years later, the heirs of Lieutenant Uriah Levy demanded that the gift be formally accepted or returned. Congress then finally complied, and today the statue is among 7 presidents who are in the rotunda of the Capitol. Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln Memorial, so well known, that also is not the first statue of Abraham Lincoln in the DC area. The first one came about just 3 years after his assassination. It stands in front of what is today the DC Court of Appeals. This is between the White House and the Capitol, a little off of Pennsylvania Avenue, which runs between the two important buildings. This was actually the third government building erected in Washington. It was originally Washington, D.C. City Hall, but now, as you see, serves as a court building. And there is the statue of Abraham Lincoln. It was also a private initiative by D.C. residents who felt remorse over the assassination of the 16th president in their city. The largest donation came from the manager of Ford's Theater. And of course, Ford's Theater is where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, watching a performance of a play. It was sculpted by an Irish-American artist who knew Lincoln and in fact was at Ford's Theater. The dedication ceremony was attended by Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln as president. Also by Ulysses S. Grant, not yet president at the time, but the Union general, and 20,000 city residents, about 20% of the city's population. And this is the oldest existing memorial to Abraham Lincoln in the United States. He once was on a much higher pedestal, but in a remodeling project, he was brought down more to a street level, as you see there. There's another quite famous statue of Abraham Lincoln in D.C., somewhat controversial. It came about in 1876. This one was funded by D.C.'s Black community as an honor to the great emancipator. And it's worth noting that the keynote speaker at the dedication ceremony in 1876 was none other than Frederick Douglass. And his speech, so important that this biography of Frederick Douglass, written by Yale history professor David Blight, he devotes the entire preface to this book to the speech that Frederick Douglass gave on the occasion of the dedication. And he notes that Douglass was not altogether complimentary of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, Abraham Lincoln's views about slavery evolved over time. Douglass noted that Lincoln told us that he would save the Union with slavery, if that's what it took to save the Union, but his views did evolve, and he later issued the Emancipation Proclamation. A couple other statues worth noting. This is a life-size statue of Abraham Lincoln next to a horse. Next to a horse because this is on the grounds of what is called Lincoln's Cottage. This is in upper northwest D.C. It's actually on the grounds of the what's commonly called the Old Soldiers' Home, or Armed Forces Retirement Community. During his presidency, Lincoln would ride his horse out to this spot, and often to get away from the pressures of the White House. It's up on a higher part of Washington, D.C., so it would get cooling breezes during the summer. And it is at this spot that he actually drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's the route that he would take from the White House in the lower portion of the screen up to the Soldiers' Home and the cottage. It was this cottage, the house here was actually the superintendent's home, but Lincoln was able to use it. And he passed by Walt Whitman's residence. The famous poet was a nurse in Washington during the Civil War. And there's a marvelous book about Walt Whitman in Washington, which notes that Walt Whitman would see Abraham Lincoln pass by. He always had a company of 25 or 30 cavalry members with sabers drawn, held upright over their shoulders. They say this guard was against his personal wish, but he lets his counselors have their way. That's in part because he did sometimes go out there by himself, or previously went out there by himself, and arrived one morning to find a bullet hole through his stovepipe hat, an assassination attempt. He also passed by what was called a contraband camp. This was fleeing enslaved people would often follow the U.S. Army, and so and they were called contrabands of war, not returned to their owners, and it's said that Lincoln would stop here, and this is part of his evolution of thinking about slavery, just in meeting people who indeed had been enslaved. And here's a statue of Abraham Lincoln right next to one of Frederick Douglass. This is at Congressional Cemetery in D.C., a very historic, very interesting cemetery. Don't have time really to talk about it here, but if you're planning a trip to DC, Congressional Cemetery is certainly worth putting on your itinerary. Statues of both the first president and the 16th president are almost side by side of each other at the front entrance of the National Cathedral, actually at the back of the long nave of the cathedral. Quite appropriate because the National Cathedral has been the site of many presidential funerals. One president has not left the cathedral. Woodrow Wilson is actually entombed in the cathedral right along the side of the long nave. Woodrow Wilson is also the namesake of an International Center for Scholars. It's sort of a government think tank focused on foreign policy, and it is located within the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. Wilson a Democrat, Reagan a Republican, a manifestation of bipartisanship, something that I think we all could agree is much needed in Washington these days. A more than life-size statue of Ronald Reagan is at, quite appropriately, Ronald Reagan National Airport. And you get a sense of the scale of this statue because standing next to him is his former transportation secretary, that's Elizabeth Dole. Woodrow Wilson is a president who actually stayed in Washington after his term in office. And this is where he lived after he lived in the White House, Woodrow Wilson House in Northwest DC. It's along Massachusetts Avenue, not too far from the cathedral. And it is maintained as a house museum today. If you're so inclined, you can visit this spot. Not too far away is the home of another former president who also has remained in Washington, though you cannot visit there. And in fact, the road is blocked off on either end of the block of this house. As I said, not too far away from Woodrow Wilson's house, a few blocks off of of Massachusetts Avenue, very near the mosque, if you know that, if you know Massachusetts Avenue, and very near Rock Creek. This is where the Obamas live in Washington, Belmont Road, just off Massachusetts Avenue. There it is on the map, and there is Woodrow Wilson's house, a little up from DuPont Circle and a little east of the National Cathedral. One president who had to flee Washington during his term was James Madison. This, of course, was during the War of 1812 when the British burned much of Washington, including the White House, as you see there. But in Montgomery County, the very small community of Brookville, very small but very historic, one of the oldest communities in Montgomery County, Brookville calls itself the United States capital for a day because this is one of the spots which to where President Madison fled during the War of 1812. He stayed in this house, and today it's commonly called the Madison House, still stands in Brookville. In August of 1814, the quiet market town of Brookville was the scene of frantic activity as the citizens of Washington fled the invasion of their city by the British in droves. On August 26th, it was, after being on the run in Northern Virginia for 2 nights, President Madison and some members of his cabinet found refuge in this house, then the home of the postmaster of Brookville, and one of the founders of the town, and his wife, who was a friend of Dolly Madison. And it is sometimes said that when he fled Washington, Madison carried with him a strong box containing the entire U.S. Treasury. That is a myth, though makes for a wonderful story. But presumably the entire U.S. Treasury probably could be carried in a strong box today because it's mainly IOUs. So those the big three memorials, as I mentioned, are sometimes joined by a fourth, and that is the relatively new memorial to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is the largest of all of them, but it also is not the first memorial to FDR. That is this simple marble block saying in memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It stands on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the Archives building built during FDR's term. And in fact, this is all that FDR wanted as a memorial to him. This sign next to the memorial notes that in September 1941, 4 years before he passed away, FDR called his friend, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, had him come over to the White House and asked the justice to remember this wish. He said, if any memorial is to be erected to me, I know exactly what it should be. It should consist of a block about this size. And he put his hand on the desk in the Oval Office. And he said he wanted it placed where it is in front of the Archives building. He said, I don't care what it is made of, whether limestone or granite or whatnot. It's actually the whatnot, it's marble. But I want it plain without any ornamentation with the simple carving in memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But of course, FDR was such a beloved president and the longest serving president, elected to 4 terms, that a much larger memorial finally came about. The planning of it took a long time. Presidential memorials are often quite fraught. It actually consists of 4 rooms representing his 4 terms. It's on the tidal basin. You see the Jefferson Memorial in the background there. Planning for it started in 1955, about a decade after his death, and it wasn't completed until 1997. And after it opened, this was an addition to it. Some disabled Americans felt that there should be representation of the fact that FDR had polio, and in large part got around by a wheelchair or relying on canes or other assistance. A marvelous guide to the architecture of Washington, the American Institute of Architects Guide, calls this an obvious afterthought to the memorial, but it also notes that though FDR himself opposed a memorial of such scale as this, his legacy clearly warrants the acreage. And part of the memorial includes a statue of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was a big part of his administration, as you know, almost an advisor to her husband in many respects. But this statue is by special dispensation because a presidential memorial is supposed to be only about the president himself. But of course, Eleanor was a big part of that administration. A lesser known reminder of FDR is what is commonly called the Bethesda Naval Hospital. Today, it's part of the Walter Reed Army Medical Complex along Wisconsin Avenue, where it runs into Rockville Pike, between Bethesda and Rockville in Montgomery County. The connection here to FDR is that FDR essentially designed the building. According to the National Archives, he modeled it after the state capitol in Lincoln, Nebraska, which he himself had dedicated during a election campaign stop in 1936. FDR sketched out on White House stationery his plan for the building. He also picked the very site. In 1938, he was driven out to a then very bucolic setting along Rockville Pike. You know, it's a very Bethesda is just growing by leaps and bounds as Montgomery County has developed so heavily. But then a small village of Bethesda. It was across from the new National Institutes of Health. The presidential car paused on a grassy knoll near some woodlands. FDR reached over the side of his open touring car, touched the ground with his cane, announcing, "We will build it here." Here's his sketch for the building on, as I said, White House stationery, FDR signature. New Naval Hospital. The center should be 15 stories tall with 2-story additions on either side. Here's what he based it on. This is the state capitol in Lincoln, Nebraska, one of the more unusual state capitals. And again, here is the Army, the medical hospital in Bethesda. One other connection between the hospital and FDR, there you see him being driven away after the dedication ceremony. But according to this book by University of Maryland history professor, it was in March 1944 at Bethesda Naval Hospital that doctors diagnosed that FDR was suffering from end-stage congestive heart failure, and they predicted that he had no more than a year to live. So think about that for a moment. That was March 1944. He ran for his 4th term, November 1944. Whether he knew that diagnosis or not, we simply don't know. The formal memorial to President John Kennedy is indeed the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. President Kennedy, of course, is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Only one other president is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and you can think about that. I'll reveal that coming up in due course. But President Kennedy is very much associated with Georgetown, lived there as a senator. It's where he met the photographer, Jacqueline Bouvet, and Martin's Tavern in Georgetown has what is called the proposal booth. You could eat lunch there. It's where then Senator JFK proposed to Jackie. Well, speaking of first ladies, on the way to Reagan National Airport, you'll pass by Lady Bird Johnson Park. It is a large park right along the George Washington Parkway. But within Lady Bird Park, there is the Lyndon Baines Johnson Memorial Grove. So a small section of the park is devoted to her husband. Another marvelous book about Washington notes that President Johnson would often go to this spot, like Lincoln, to get away from the pressures of the White House. Lincoln, of course, going to Lincoln's cottage. And now there's a grove of white pine trees, a meadow, and a 19-foot high granite megalith quarried from near his Texas ranch that serve as a living memorial to President Johnson. There's the granite stone quarried from LBJ's ranch in Texas. So a number of 20th century presidents have buildings named for them in Washington. I mentioned the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center already. This is the commonly called the Executive Office Building. It's actually named for a president. If we were in person, this could be kind of a quiz, but it's actually the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. When built in the late 19th century, was purported to be the largest office building in the world. This marvelous book that I mentioned before notes that this building was repeatedly threatened with radical revisions and was almost torn down. But in 1957, a presidential commission did indeed recommend total demolition, but in time, it was spared, and today is one of the real landmarks in the nation's capital. Quite gaudy in architecture, but one of the landmarks, as I said, of DC, and absolutely gorgeous inside. Although they don't have public tours of the building. This rather plain office building is also named for a former president. It's at the base of Capitol Hill. It gives you a little bit of hint. This is actually the Gerald Ford House Office Building. Jerry Ford appointed a vice president by Richard Nixon, and but for a long, he served on Capitol Hill for most of his career, including as a Republican leader. This is the Commerce Department building, actually named for a president, named for the president who unfortunately couldn't deal with the Depression, Herbert Hoover Commerce Department building. Right next door is the Environmental Protection Agency building. The building itself is named for a president, but it's not the, it's named for President Bill Clinton, though it's not like the Commerce building. It's not the Clinton Environmental Protection Agency building. His name is just on the building itself. But the Department of State building is actually named for a president, Harry Truman, and a president, and this is the Office of Personnel Management. Certainly anyone who worked for the federal government knows this building well. It's named the Theodore Roosevelt building because, in fact, Teddy Roosevelt, helped to create the civil service. The CIA is named for a president, one of the Bushes, the first Bush, because he actually served as director of intelligence for a time. The Education Department building is named for Lyndon Johnson because he actually is the president who signed the first piece of federal legislation having to do with education, traditionally a very local matter. And hearkening back to the LBJ Ranch in Texas, that's where he signed the bill. Beside the one-room schoolhouse that he had attended, and sitting next to him is his former teacher. In front of that building today, somewhat screening off the building, is a formal memorial to President Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is one of a few presidents who has both a formal memorial and a building named for him. Theodore Roosevelt is another. I mentioned the Roosevelt Office of Personnel Management building. This is his memorial. It's on Theodore Roosevelt Island. And since it's an island, well, a lot of people go there, but the animals as well. Thomas Jefferson also has a formal memorial and a building. The main building of the Library of Congress is named for Thomas Jefferson, because after the War of 1812, the Library of Congress, part of the Capitol building, was burned, and so he sold his personal library to restock the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress, the reading room inside is, well, all of the interior is just a gorgeous building inside. Again, another one that you should put on your itinerary for a tour of Washington. The Library of Congress now has two other buildings. Behind it is the John Adams building, and off to the side is the James Madison building. But there's a distinction between these two. The one named for James Madison is a formal memorial to James Madison, and there is a statue of him inside, but the John Adams building is not technically a formal memorial to John Adams. There is no formal memorial to John Adams, and the presidential historian David McCullough says it is a glaring omission, only one of the presidential founding fathers who does not have a memorial. There is a private effort underway to create a memorial to both John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, but thus far, no memorial has come about. There is a small marker inside the Capitol to his son, John Quincy Adams, because after his presidency, John Quincy Adams was elected a representative from Massachusetts and served for many years. In fact, he died in the Capitol building of a stroke. Another president who had a presence in Washington after his term in office was William Howard Taft. He later served as a Chief Justice, and so a bust of William Howard Taft is inside the Supreme Court building, along with busts of every other Chief Justice. And William Howard Taft is, in fact, the other president who is buried at Arlington Cemetery. Here is his marker. And here, of course, is the eternal flame marking the gravesite of President Kennedy. A quite large memorial, though not many people are familiar with it. It's right in front of the west side of the Capitol. This is the memorial to President Ulysses S. Grant. On either side, scenes depicting the Civil War. Largest equestrian statue and memorial when it was constructed. In fact, when Grant died, his funeral procession in New York City surpassed any public demonstration in the country up until that time. Grant's reputation suffered after his presidency, but it's going under a reevaluation these days. And perhaps this biography of Grant by Ron Chernow can do for Grant what he did for Alexander Hamilton. William McKinley has this this memorial. It's actually it's actually in Washington County, other side of Frederick County, on the grounds of Antietam. McKinley was a sergeant during the Civil War. He was at Antietam personally and without orders, served hot coffee and warm food to every man in his regiment. And so this memorial was erected on the spot to him. There you see at the base a depiction of that. Near the Capitol also, a statue to James Garfield, another assassinated president. He was actually shot in the train station not too far from this spot. Just 16 years after Lincoln's assassination, two traumatic events in the country's history. He lingered for quite a while. Medicine not terribly advanced. Probably medicine probably could have saved him today. A marvelous book about that if you're interested. But actually, the bullet was lodged in his spine. And actually, this is part of Garfield's spine. It's on display at a museum in Montgomery County. It's a national museum. It's the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Also on display is another exhibit connected to another president, another assassinated president. It's described as a little black mass, no bigger than the end of my finger, dull, motionless, and harmless, yet the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize. That's quoting the doctor who treated Abraham Lincoln after he was shot at Ford's Theater. And what's on display is the actual bullet that took Lincoln's life, as well as the shirt sleeves of the doctors and other part. Well, we don't need to go into that. So I wanted to end with a few few spots in Frederick. Lincoln, of course, did stop in Frederick. It was on his way after visiting the Antietam battlefield and wanted to pay tribute to the wounded soldiers. And of course, you know that Frederick served as many of the Frederick churches served as makeshift hospitals for the many wounded. Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. And so Lincoln was at the old train station in Frederick at East All Saints Streets and Market. There is this marker noting that. He was also in Frederick to visit one of his wounded generals. And this plaque is on the side of a house at 119 Record Street in the middle of downtown. President Harry Truman, shortly after he left the White House, famously stopped for gas in Frederick, bought some soda. Truman and his wife Bess drank Cokes while his car was being serviced at the station for about 30 minutes. The gas station owner mentions that Truman's Chrysler Imperial arrived in the parking lot. It was a beautiful car. After Truman had his Coke and his car filled with gas, the gas station owner would not let him pay his fee, saying, "I just wanted to be able to say I treated President Truman to a tank of gas." He was the kind of guy who could talk to you about anything, fixing cars, changing oil, or politics. And the famous Coca-Cola bottle is now on display at the Museum of Frederick County History. And still a gas station of sorts. Well, it's more a service car service repair station today. The Frederick News Post has noted that starting with George Washington, presidents have beat a well-traveled path to Frederick. Here's a photo of President Kennedy on a campaign stop before he was president. And of course, President Frederick has hosted almost every president since, I think every president since Shangri-La was designated as the presidential retreat during FDR's administration. And the name changed to Camp David during the presidency of Eisenhower. And here's President George H.W. Bush at a Frederick Keys game. So I've mentioned almost every recent president except for George W. Bush and Carter. No memorial in the area to Bush 2, probably too early. None for Jimmy Carter, who you've probably been reading is celebrating his almost his 99th birthday. The only connection I could come up with for Carter in the DC area was this school, this public school in DC, because this is where Amy Carter attended when she was living in the White House when her father was president. There is Rosalind Carter taking Amy to this school about a dozen blocks away from the White House. And more recently, Richard Nixon. Will there ever be a memorial to the only president who resigned? Well, there is this bust outside the Senate chambers in the Capitol, because there is a bust of every single vice president. And the Senate website notes that this sculpture collection celebrates the great figures of our national history. That was put there in 1979. So, of course, there's also a bust of our former governor, Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's first vice president, but also resigned in disgrace. Perhaps the least likely memorial is the one to James Buchanan. It's in a quite popular DC park, Meridian Hill Park, but a recent survey of presidential historians rated both the greats and the not greats, with James Buchanan coming in dead last. And I didn't really mention any of the others, though there is Donald Trump. You can find Donald Trump at the Presidential Portrait Gallery, although it's a photograph. All the other presidents have paintings. A painting has not yet been done of Donald Trump. And I don't know, would you want to be the painter who would have to paint Donald Trump? I don't think that it would, I don't think anything would please him, but I guess we will just end with that. And so let me stop share and hope I've left enough time for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Ralph. Now, if you have a question, would you please unmute, ask the question, and when the question has been taken care of, mute yourself again so that other people can take over. How about, and you should raise your hand, by the way. I hope you are now going to go into the gallery mode so you can see all your neighbors. And we'll also be able to see hands when people have questions. I can start by asking one question. Grant decided not to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. He's a very well-known military person. I would have expected he might have gone there.
Yes, yes, you would think so. But there is, of course, the Grant's tomb in New York City, and that's why the funeral procession was in New York City. And of course, it was neglected for some time also, and sometimes the butt of jokes who's buried in Grant's tomb. But it has been nicely restored, and it is now something of a tourist spot also in New York City.
We have a chat here.
Although not a monument. Are you familiar? Oh, are you familiar with the thousands of original Capitol stones in Rock Creek Park? Yes, I am. Diane mentioned that this is part of a course that I give for the American University Lifelong Learning program called Off the DC Path in the DC area, presidents and nature spots and all kinds of other things. And so, yes, I do talk about Rock Creek Park, and it was a remodeling of the Capitol in the middle of the 20th century. The Capitol was originally built with limestone, which was degrading, showing signs of weathering. And so a lot of the stones from the Capitol, carefully numbered, were, what to do with them. They were piled up for many years in Rock Creek Park, and not well publicized, but locals sort of knew where they were. And in fact, old pillars, old columns from the Capitol were placed quite ceremoniously in the National Arboretum to the east of the Capitol, several miles east of the Capitol. But these other stones were just piled haphazardly in Rock Creek Park. Though within a past year or so, apparently more and more people were finding them. And so the National Park Service has been in the process of relocating them. I have not been there recently to know whether they have all been removed from Rock Creek Park or not. But if they have not been, they are supposed to be removed from Rock Creek Park and stored in an undisclosed location.
Any other questions? You did such a good job that there aren't many questions left, Ralph. There's a thank you down there in the chat.
I sometimes include churches that are associated with presidents, and probably the most famous ones are New York Presbyterian Church, and they actually have a Lincoln pew in their church. St. James Episcopal Church, no, St. John's Episcopal Church, very near Lafayette Square, so about a block from the White House, is unofficially called the Church of the Presidents because every president since Madison, I think, has worship there, and they officially have a president's pew. It was paid for by a president that I didn't mention, John Tyler, I think, and of course very close to the White House. So indeed, various churches like to claim various presidents as having worshipped in their church during his presidency, his thus far. But assuredly, we will have a woman president at some time.
How did you define the area over which you were going to talk? You went as far as Brookville. We lived in Olney, fairly close to there. You could have gone further than that, I guess, also, but I'm not sure.
Yes, because this is for a course about DC area, I do pretty much keep it, sort of within the Beltway or just beyond. But extend further to certainly include the Washington Monument State Park, very near you all, and the Antietam statue for President McKinley. Anything that has an interesting story behind it.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
I think Anne has a question.
Anne, unmute yourself.
I did. This was wonderful, and I can understand why Diane would have wanted us to see this. I want to thank you so much. Growing up in Frederick County, there's so much that we weren't taught in school. I'm particularly interested in the bust of George Washington, the statue of George Washington with no clothes on. I mean, what was the reason behind that?
Let me pull the book.
Other than showing him as trying to be a virile man or something? I mean, that was, I mean, that's my mind went.
It was supposed to be showing him in the likeness of a classical figure, hearkening back to ancient Rome. And it was an Italian sculptor. That's why the statue had to be brought over from Italy. I was just looking through here, but that's basically the point, because originally so much of the architecture in Washington is classical architecture, hearkening back to Greece and Rome, that it was sort of all a part of that, that the United States aspired to be among the great nations in history, Greece, Rome, and so on, as well as perhaps artistic license.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great job, Ralph. I think we all very much enjoyed it.
In fact, if I could just share my screen quickly, speaking of artistic license, I thought I was running out of time, so.
You have a few minutes.
Oh, here we go. When I was having a little fun with the Donald Trump photograph, the next one was going to be,
wow.
This is the official portrait of Bill Clinton in the National Portrait Gallery. And so I just thought in connection with artistic license, I've never read what Bill Clinton thinks about this, his official portrait.
Are they trying to make it like Kennedy? Is that the idea?
I'm not sure, but it's certainly modern art, and you either like modern art or you don't.
Well, Kennedy,
and I probably mentioned Lincoln more than any other president. Worth noting that a life-size portrait of Lincoln went on display in the National Portrait Gallery this February, and it's on loan for the next 4 years. The National Portrait Gallery, it's part of the Smithsonian. It's also a marvelous spot to visit. And, the whole point of my Off the Beaten Path course is spots that you won't find the tourists at, because they go to all the well-known spots. These are the lesser known spots. I would, though, highly recommend Lincoln's Cottage. They give a marvelous tour there. And you can almost sneak into Washington without too much of the traffic because it's upper Northwest.
Very good. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Great
Thanks
job.
Thanks very much, everyone.
There you go. Ralph, you did a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for scheduling it. And always a pleasure to see you in class, Diane.
Oh, thank you. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.